Welcome to the Everything History podcast, and we are back to the developing story of the French Revolution in April of 1791 with episode 16, The Flight to Varennes.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Okay, quick recap. Worry not either, this will be quick. After all, we're going to be discussing the flight of royalty from France, not to mention the always interesting intrigues of European politics. So, previously on the Everything History podcast, France was devolving back into revolutionary anarchy, and the Jacobin Club was rapidly gaining public and political support, and as they did, their political leanings became more and more radical, which is something that will be addressed in this episode. The process was not complete, but radicalism clearly had a hold on France again, because after the Honorable Mirabeau died in early April of 1791, the royal family was essentially being held hostage in their Paris apartments by an angry mob. And to top it off, General Lafayette was unable to control his own National Guardsmen. They had joined with the frenzied and radical crowd. Thus, France failed to keep the peace and maintain national ideological unity, and that is where we pick up today. Before the mob harassed King Louis and his family, preventing their Easter trip to St. Cloud, it seems that he was unaware that he and his family were essentially highly privileged hostages. Queen Marie-Antoinette had no such delusions. She had long suspected the worst of the French people. However, after the events of April 17th, all such illusions were shattered. The king was taken aback and feared for the safety of his family, and it was then, after meeting with radicalism face to face, that King Louis began to actually consider escaping France. Which I actually find quite humorous, because by containing their king, the Parisians had actually convinced him to leave, which is what they feared he was going to do in the first place. It almost seems as if the French radicals were trying to instigate the king to try and escape with his family, but I'm not going to tread down that rabbit hole. Rather, we must continue our story, and it will be a few months before King Louis finally tries to escape, and in the spring of 1791, France began to experience a labor surplus. Mix that with a worsening economic depression, and you have a recipe for societal upheaval. Unemployment had been rising for some time in France, but in truth, most French people had been in and out of work since before the Estates General of 1789, yet as inflation began to occur due to the rapid printing of assignats, their wages began to mean very little as the weeks went by in 1791. During March, April, and May, as many as 80,000 workers gathered in Paris to demand higher wages. These were tailors, blacksmiths, carpenters, in other words, skilled shop laborers. Despite their protests, though, there was nothing to be done. None of the master craftsmen or industry owners had any money to delegate to higher wages. They were too broke themselves and surviving only in debt. And after laborers continued to organize almost into something akin to unions, the National Assembly moved in and passed a proposal by Le Chapelier that banned organized labor, especially in industry. That was passed in June of 1791, and this was significant not only because it showed the Assembly drawing a line in the sand on labor, but because it had been passed by the extremely radical Le Chapelier, a prominent Jacobin. Speaking of the Jacobin Club, there's a lot of new developments within the Jacobins, and thereby within French politics. Oh yes, as summer approached, the Jacobin Club began to fracture, and they began fracturing as certain groups and people within the club began to differ strongly in their opinions. For a long time, several months, the Jacobins had been almost unanimously championing the leftist, radically Republicanesque views in the Assembly. But as April came around, many began to fear that everything was moving too radical too fast, especially after the death of Comte de Mirabeau. For example, Le Chapelier, Antoine Bonnave, and Adrien Duport, previously the leaders of Jacobin radicalism, began to try and pump the brakes on Jacobin extremism. After all, it had been Le Chapelier himself that had proposed the summer legislation that had banned organized labor. Quite a centrist or conservative move. And he was supported by many of the other Jacobin leaders who agreed that the status quo needed to be maintained. However, there were still Jacobin extremists. A British ambassador said in mid-April, quote, "There is a set of men whose object is the total annihilation of monarchy, however limited," end quote. The ambassador there was not so subtly implying that this, quote, set of men were in favor of ousting royalty, even by force, deadly force. And by late April it had become obvious who was leading this group of radical Jacobins, a man by the name of Maximilien Robespierre. I have mentioned him several times before, for he was becoming a prominent delegate in the National Constituent Assembly. So far, he was just an extreme leftist, but soon he will become the champion of terror in France. A British man named W.A. Miles attended a meeting of the Jacobin Club and described Robespierre as, quote, a stern man, rigid in his principles, plain, unaffected in his manners, above corruption, and a man who despised wealth, end quote. Miles went on to say of Robespierre, quote, he is in his heart Republican. I watch him closely every night. He really is a character to be contemplated. He is growing every hour into consequence, and, strange to relate, the whole National Assembly consider him insignificant. And when I mentioned my suspicions that he would soon be a man of sway in short time and govern the million, I was laughed at, end quote. The British W. Miles was laughed at, but he will sadly have the last laugh. There's also another matter that requires explanation as well in the spring of 1791, and that is the events going on during the French Revolution in Haiti, a French colony on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. The colony was almost entirely black Frenchmen, mainly enslaved, but the white elite were still running the Haitian colony. But after revolution broke out in 1789 in France, the black Haitians demanded abolition from slavery and recognition as full French citizens. In 1790, the National Assembly had declined and upheld slavery in all French colonies. Robespierre and the radicals had opposed this move. In the fall of 1790, a large contingent of Haitian slaves revolted but were massacred by the white Frenchmen on the island, and less than half a year later, a new revolt spawned. This time it was massive, and the African slaves vastly outnumbered their white overlords. Hearing of this news, Robespierre proposed a measure that rights be granted throughout the French world to free blacks, and the measure was carried handily in Robespierre's favor. The Haitian revolt did not stop, however, and it was to continue for the next 13 years. I will rarely mention Haiti from now on because the Haitian revolt and revolution requires a podcast of its own to really explain in the correct context. Nevertheless, it is something interesting to keep in the back of our minds as France continues in its revolutionary seizures because it reminds me, us, that the French Revolution was a global affair. Okay, now back to politics. As the spring of 1791 warmed into summer, Robespierre and his, quote, set of men were not yet popular. They were gaining support slowly, but the leaders of French politics were still the cool conservative heads. Lafayette was falling out of favor, but Le Chapelier, Barnave, Duport, and Alexandre Lemaitre were still popular and trying to maintain political composure. Yet, one event in June of 1791 was going to flip the entire script of the French Revolution. This was the flight to Varennes, in which the French royalty of the illustrious House of Bourbon attempted to escape from their own country. The flight was a major turning point in the French Revolution, and this is its story. The flight to Varennes began to be conceived immediately after the royal family had been forcibly made to stay in Paris during April, and in the last week of April, King Louis wrote to the general of the old royal army, Marquis de Bouillé, in hopes of gaining assistance to travel incognito into Austria. The general wrote in his memoirs of the letter he received, saying, quote, the king wrote to me that he hoped to leave Paris. I was to indicate the route he should take for Montmédy. End quote. Montmédy, by the way, is on the border of France and the Austrian Netherlands, and the reason Louis and Antoinette desired to escape into Austrian territory is because it was ruled by Emperor Leopold II, Marie-Antoinette's brother. General Bouillé agreed to help, and slowly a plan began to be formed over the following weeks. The main architect of the plan was a Swedish officer in the French army named Axel Fersen. Fersen is famous because many non-historians believe that he was a lover of Marie-Antoinette. There is no proof for this, but he was a particular favorite of the Queen. And it is true that he sent many, many boxes of calfskin gloves and roses to the Queen, which is pretty weird in itself. But anyways, Fersen had the plan set up, it seems, by late May, early June, but the escape was delayed repeatedly for bizarre reasons. It seems that King Louis was extremely nervous and skittish about actually trying to leave Paris. Yet the plan did finally come together on the night of June 20th. False passports were readied and everyone involved took up a new identity for the journey. The queen was dressed in a simple black coat and was to be the governess of the children. The child prince, the Dauphin, was dressed as a girl, and the king's sister Elizabeth was meant to be the nurse. King Louis XVI himself wore a wig, a plain hat, and coat, and on the journey he went by the name Durand, and he was meant to be the carriage's valet. Fersen had repeatedly urged the king and queen to travel separately in small but fast carriages, but Marie-Antoinette insisted on a massive slow coach so the family could stay together. I obviously understand why the queen would want to stick together, but it proved to be a fatal mistake because it would cause them to travel quite slowly. It's also worth noting that according to all reports, the royals took a crapload of baggage, and the escape began on June 20th around midnight. The king left in disguise in the coach and was meant to pick up the rest of his family outside the perimeter of security, but it seems that luck was already turning against them, because it seems that the queen got lost as she escaped the grounds with the children because she arrived half an hour late to the coach, and King Louis must have been twiddling his thumbs in anxiousness, because they were on an extremely tight schedule. You see, the journey was about 200 miles, and they needed to reach a town by the name of Ponte de Saint-Vel by 2:30 in the afternoon on June 21st. It was imperative that they reached its destination in time because that was where their carriage was to begin receiving military escorts from General Bouilly's forces so that they could safely make it to the border. But from the get-go, the royal family was going far too slow. And after looking at the reports and letters, I really have to blame the queen in large part for causing them to be so dang slow. And as I continue the story, you'll see why. Okay, despite the poor start to the trip, the morning hours of the journey went well, and they were well out of Paris and on their way to the Austrian Netherlands by dawn. Some 30 miles outside Paris, they stopped for fresh horses and breakfast, but the queen also insisted on having her maids join them, which took quite a bit of time and would slow them for the rest of the journey. Now, I don't want to hate on Queen Marie-Antoinette too much, but come on, Marie, this is an escape, not a vacation. Not to mention the fact that they no longer looked inconspicuous at all. One historian wrote in sarcasm, quote, "There was nothing out of the ordinary in a fast-traveling, heavily loaded black and green coach with yellow wheels baggage swaying to arouse any suspicion," end quote. Once more, that's sarcasm. And after a few more hours of travel, they were struck with misfortune once more. Near Chalon, their carriage struck a post of some kind, snapping the axle of their wheels. It took an hour to fix this mistake, and by the time they got going again, they were 4 hours behind schedule, thanks to the Queen's delays, unnecessary stops, and bad luck. This was a major problem, and likely the chief reason their plan failed. Yet by noon, they were over halfway to Montmédy, and their personal journals indicate that they were in good spirits and believed that they would actually make it. Reality, though, had other plans. Back in Paris, the National Guardsmen, politicians, and the general population had discovered, or gotten word of, the royal family's disappearance and escape. And they knew it was an escape because the bodyguards and National Guardsmen, including Lafayette, had no idea where they'd run off to. And the king had left a note saying that they were leaving. I will refer to that note in just a moment. The discovery of the escape was to be expected, but news travels extremely fast, at least compared to a carriage that stops over 20 times on its journey. And in Paris, Lafayette was put under heavy scrutiny for letting the king slip through his security. Robespierre threatened the general, saying, quote, "You, Monsieur Lafayette, will answer to the assembly on the fate of the king with your head," end quote. By this time, it was already 2:30 in the afternoon, which, if you remember, is the time that the king and his family should have arrived at Pont des Sommes to receive a military escort. And the mounted soldiers were there on time, but the king was nowhere to be found. Another hour passed, nothing. And after 2 hours, the townsfolk began to fear that these soldiers were there to enforce some sort of taxation, and began to harass the soldiers with questions and aggressive remarks. The royal soldiers explained that they were not there for any such reasons, but the villagers did not believe them because the soldiers could not admit why they were really there. The commander gave the king 1 more hour, but it was to no avail. The king did not show up and the soldiers left before any conflict broke out with the villagers. And it was then that the whole plan was ruined because without a military escort, the rest of the journey was extremely perilous. And when the king and his family reached Pont des Sommes 5 hours too late, the villagers were wary, and their over-encumbered carriage was noted by many townsfolk. There was only about 60 miles to go at that point, but they still traveled at a slow speed. So slow, in fact, that by the time they reached the next major settlement, Saint Manihold, the news of the royal escape had already reached the countryside. And as they passed through the city, a postmaster, apparently a veteran of the French cavalry, recognized the king and queen and sent word ahead to the city of Varennes. And it is said that as they left Saint Manihold, every shopkeep and aware citizen stared down the royal carriage as they left. The king and queen were not unaware either. They were extremely frightened as they traveled in darkness to Varennes. They hoped that the city would still be asleep so that they could go quietly on their way, but once more, reality set in. Varennes and all its citizens were wide awake as their carriages arrived at around 11 p.m. on June 21st. Provincial National Guardsmen had been raised and no loyal troops or escorts were there, or awake I should say, to help the royal family. It was then the townsfolk quickly apprehended them and held them under guard in a local prosecutor's office until the morning. Thus the flight to Montmédy, or the flight to Varennes as we know it, failed. And the next day the royal family was escorted by a force of 6,000 back to Paris. And as they entered the capital, tens of thousands watched the arrival of their fallen monarch. And what's still more intriguing is that reports have it that over 60,000 citizens watched them in dead silence. And this may well have been because the Jacobins in the National Assembly had passed the following instruction that was posted around the capital before the royal entry. The sign read, quote, "Anyone who applauds the king will be beaten. Anyone who insults him will be hanged." End quote. Now all of these events bring a question to mind. What was the true intent of the king's plan? Well, there were many theories after the news broke out in France. The radical Jacobins with the strong Republican tendencies asserted that the king had planned to go into Austria and raise a European coalition with his brother-in-law, Leopold II, to march back into France and restore his status as an absolute monarch. This story was bogus, though, and it was pure fear-mongering by the radicals because they had no evidence. But it was believable. There are a few other minor theories, but the accurate one is revealed to us in the note that King Louis XVI left behind in Paris before he attempted his escape. The letter he wrote was written in the third person, so realize that he's writing about himself here. King Louis wrote that he would have stayed on the throne in the kingdom of the French in alliance with the National Assembly if it was safe and stable to remain. But he wrote that he was forced to leave because he was, quote, witness to the destruction of the kingdom, end quote. He went on to say that he would no longer suffer to, quote, see all authority ignored, personal property violated, people's safety everywhere in danger, crimes remaining unpunished, and a complete anarchy established above the law, end quote. He also addressed the radicalism that had developed in the mob and assembly, saying, quote, the spirit that reigns in the clubs is to destroy what is left of royalty and to establish some metaphysical and philosophical government which can never be achieved in reality. And in the conclusion of his letter, King Louis wrote directly to his people, quote, people of France, is that what you intended when you sent your representatives to the National Assembly? Did you wish for the anarchy and despotism of the clubs to replace the monarchical government under which the nation has prospered for 1,400 years? Did you wish to see your king showered with insults and deprived of his liberty while his only goal was to establish yours? People of France, and especially you Parisians, be wary of the suggestions and lies of your false friends. Come back to your king. He will always be your father, your best friend. What pleasure he will have to see himself once again in your midst when a constitution that he has freely accepted ensures that our holy religion will be respected, that government will be established on a stable footing, and will be useful through its actions, that each man's goods and position will no longer be disturbed, that laws will no longer be infringed with impunity, and that liberty will be placed on a firm and unshakable base. End quote. So there you have it. The reason King Louis, according to himself, attempted immigration is because his France had fallen prey to radicalism and societal anarchy. He also said, in truth, that anything he had done or sanctioned since October of 1789 had been done under duress. And he had finished by pleading with his people to end the chaos of revolution, and under appropriate circumstances he would return as, quote, your father, your best friend. And it's also worth noting that he wrote all of this when he expected to be free, so he was at liberty to write the truth. That was King Louis's intent, but did the people actually believe it? How did the people in the National Assembly react to the flight to Varennes? Perhaps more importantly, how did the radicals react? By the way, the reason I stray from calling these radicals of the Jacobin and Cordeliers clubs Republicans, little r or big R, is because the politicians that had those views themselves went out of their way before June of 1791 to be referred to as radical rather than Republicans. Because to be Republican was to be in complete favor of abolishing the monarchy and the rest of the leftover governmental traditions of France. These radicals, like Robespierre, were not able to openly declare themselves Republican because they would have lost favor with the people. But after the king and queen publicly disgraced the entire French kingdom by trying to escape, the public opinion was flipped on its head. The flight to Varennes was a political turning point, because now it was open season for the radical politicians to declare themselves Republicans and seize the reins of power. And I will leave you with those questions and that thought as I stop the episode here. I won't be answering those questions next episode, though, because joining us will be Professor Mark Hertzman, who studies Latin American and Brazilian history with a strong emphasis on race, culture, and gender. And if you liked what you heard, make sure to subscribe on iTunes, and if you have any questions, concerns, or corrections, send them to everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.